Okay, so in this video we're going to cover the Cold War in the United States, the developing fear of communism, as well as the rising nuclear arms race. So in the United States we have a growing fear of communism during this time period, really going back through World War II. This is called the Second Red Scare. And during this time period there's an idea that Truman is not doing enough to deal with communism in the United States, specifically communist influence in the U.S. government. So they're going to set up an organization. Part of that organization becomes the Loyalty Review Board, and that board's job is to investigate government employees and dismiss any not loyal to the United States. Another group, the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is an organization in the House of Representatives. So the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC or HUAC, and their job was to find communist influence in the United States. The thing they're most famous for is investigating communist influence in the film industry or in Hollywood. There's a specific case where they have two people that are accused of communism. They bring in 10 witnesses, those 10 witnesses refused to cooperate because they felt like the investigation compromised their constitutional rights, so they refused to cooperate, and all 10 are imprisoned. What ends up happening through the House Un-American Activities Committee is anybody who is deemed to be associated with communism, and there's this idea that communist influence is rampant through the film industry, that anybody who has a connection to communism is blacklisted, or they struggle to continue to find work in communism. There's an example of one actor, musician, Paul Robinson, who at the high point in his career was making over $150,000 a year. Again, this is in the 1950s, making $150,000 a year, traveling internationally. The House Un-American Activities Committee is going to withdraw his passport so he can't travel out of the country, and then he gets blacklisted so he can't get jobs in the United States, in Hollywood, or in the music industry, and he goes from making $150,000 a year to $3,000 a year during this time period. So there's a big concern that the things that we were putting out for entertainment might have a communist influence, and so that's being investigated. And then the McCarran Internal Security Act made it illegal to plan any action which may lead to the establishment of a totalitarian dictatorship, which is essentially saying that it is illegal to support the development of a communist party in the United States, which is unconstitutional. So that is actually something that states are going to continue to develop, that idea. Spy cases are going to help kind of generate this growing fear of communism in the United States. Alger Hiss is one of the big ones. He's a former State Department official accused of sending documents to the Soviets. Because of the statute of limitations, the charges come up against him after a time period that he can be charged for treason, but he is charged with lying under oath, and he's sentenced to 5 years. He maintained his innocence the whole time, but in documents released by the Soviet Union, I think in the late 80s, it was pretty obvious that he had released information to the Soviet Union. So again, this idea that somebody working, a high-ranking official in the State Department for the United States is aiding the Soviet Union, it is going to spread that fear of communism in the United States. And then you have the case of the Rosenbergs. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg was a husband and wife. They're accused of passing along atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. They're both found guilty and sentenced to death, and then it was revealed eventually that Ethel, if at all, knew very little of what was going on and played a very minor role, but they're both sentenced to death for treason, and the judge said that actually he considered what they did worse than murder, because they were giving the Soviets the opportunity to continue to build these massive weapons. Okay, so if we go back, you've got this growing fear of communism. You have organizations like the Loyalty Review Board, which is set up, a government agency, and the House Un-American Activities Committee that are set up to deal with what we saw as the growing threat of communism in the United States. You have the Hollywood 10 who get imprisoned for the idea that they weren't going to cooperate with an investigation that was unconstitutional. Any members in Hollywood that are going against kind of HUAC or that are in support of communism get blacklisted. You have the government coming out with the McCarran Internal Security Act and saying essentially it is illegal to support the rise of a communist party. You have spy cases that are making people understand that communism really is in the United States and there really are people helping the Soviet Union. And so that leads to Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy is the most well-known anti-communist, and he's known for really going on this kind of crazy witch hunt against communists, trying to find communists in the government. And what we develop from McCarthy is this idea of McCarthyism, or accusations of communism without evidence. So McCarthy's accusing anybody and everybody of communism within the government. He thinks that communism is rampant throughout our government and there's a plan for a communist takeover. And really, he has a lot of steam for a while until he accuses high-ranking Army officials of being communist, and that these Army officials were going to turn the Army over to the Soviet Union. And those accusations in themselves aren't what lose him support, so people can even get behind that idea. But in the Senate investigation, which McCarthy goes through for this, he's going to go in and bully witnesses, make outlandish accusations, and people start to realize that he's kind of off his rocker a little bit. And so the accusations that he's been making about communism, people start to question, and ultimately McCarthy's going to lose support because he goes so over the top in all of this. So Joseph McCarthy is a key figure for us to know when we talk about anti-communism in the United States. He was a senator from Wisconsin who leads these anti-communist witch hunts. We get the term McCarthyism from him, which is the idea that you make accusations of communism without any proof. And all of this fear of communism is going to help, like the fear of communism we talked about, is going to help McCarthy in his crusade. Now, last thing, so you can see some of the anti-communist stuff that we're talking about. By 1953, you had 39 states who had made it illegal to advocate the overthrow of the government, which is breaking the constitutional right of free speech, as it says. So if you want to advocate for the overthrow of the government, that is your constitutional right through free speech. This went as far as to say that pro wrestlers in Indiana had to swear oaths of loyalty. So we're talking about everything from limiting constitutional free speech to as far as making pro wrestlers sign oaths of loyalty. We had experiments going on the street where citizens refused to sign petitions that directly quoted the Declaration of Independence because people were afraid that they would be signing something that contained communist ideas. So that's kind of a twofold thing. One, people don't know what's in the Declaration of Independence, but more importantly, people are so scared of being associated with communism that something as simple as the Declaration of Independence, people wouldn't sign a petition because they were afraid that it might associate them with communism, even though it was just the Declaration of Independence. And the government is investigating people from every walk of life, every social class, different professions. The idea that developed during this time period, especially from McCarthy and his accusations, was that no one was safe from the accusation of communism, that anybody could be tied to it at any time. And so there was a big fear that your neighbor was communist, or the mayor of your town was communist, or the senators from your state. And with McCarthy making accusations against everybody, it seemed like anybody in the U.S. could be communist. Okay, looks like we've got two more things, I believe. So brinkmanship is the policy that the United States develops. We've talked about the Truman Doctrine, trying to stop the spread of communism. Brinkmanship is what's going to follow that for us. So we start this nuclear arms race. The U.S. actually beats the USSR in developing the H-bomb, or the hydrogen bomb, which was 67 times more powerful than the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima. So we win that as far as the arms race is concerned, but our advantage lasts less than a year because the Soviets quickly developed theirs after ours. But we're in this process of what we call the arms race. That's going to take us to this policy of brinkmanship, which is the willingness to go to the edge of all-out war. What that means is we developed this idea that we are going away from things that we talked about, like appeasement or gray areas. And when the Soviets act, we are willing to react to Soviet action, to taking the world to the edge of all-out war. And this is where you start to see the heightened fear of a nuclear fallout in the United States, or really in the world, where people are building bomb shelters because the U.S. and the Soviet Union are building more and more powerful bombs. At the same time, the attitudes towards the two countries are becoming more and more strenuous. The CIA becomes really big during this time period, which is our covert operations investigative unit. the Central Intelligence Agency. The Soviet Union has the KGB that's opposite this, and what becomes really important during this time period is the idea of espionage or spying on each other. We're going to reduce the size of our Army and Navy, and we're going to expand our Air Force and our focus on the development of atomic weapons. The idea behind expanding our Air Force and our nuclear developments and cutting back from the Army and Navy was this idea that brinkmanship had taken us to, that in the event of a war with the Soviet Union, what we were going to need was big bombs and the Air Force's ability to carry out bombing raids that if we got to a war with the Soviet Union, we weren't going to be dealing with the Army or the Navy in an invasion of Russia or something like that. We were relying on big bombs and the Air Force to carry them out. The Soviet Union during this time period is going to create the Warsaw Pact, which links 7 Eastern European countries. It's kind of the opposite of NATO for the United States. So we have the 12 nations of NATO. The Warsaw Pact is going to have the Soviet Union and 7 Eastern European nations. The Eisenhower Doctrine that's developed this time period is like the Marshall Plan or the Truman Doctrine before it. It is specific to the Middle East. The Soviet Union is focusing on spreading communism to the Middle East, and we say that we are going to defend the Middle East against any attack by a communist country. This goes back to this idea of brinkmanship, that we are willing to take even the spread of communism to the edge of all-out war. Now, interestingly, that while we're saying that we will protect the Middle East against the spread of communism, Hungary is going to have an uprising that they try to overthrow Soviet rule. There's Hungarian politicians who, in Eastern Europe, this is what we're talking about, in Eastern Europe, try to overthrow the Soviets, and they're assuming that when they start that, because of policies like the Truman Doctrine and the Eisenhower Doctrine, that the United States is going to come in and help them. So they start their uprising, America doesn't come to the rescue, and you have 30,000 Hungarians that are going to die, and another 200,000 that are going to flee to Western European countries, because the United States decided that while they want to stop the spread of communism, getting into Eastern Europe where Russia had, or the Soviet Union had a stronghold, was not something that they wanted to do. The last thing for today, the Cold War in the skies. Stalin's going to die and Khrushchev is going to take over, and Khrushchev starts with this idea that you could expand communist ideals peacefully through competition with the West. So Stalin's idea was you spread it through force, and you force countries to take on communism. Khrushchev, on the other hand, thinks that when people see the benefits of communism, they will willingly accept it. So he thinks communism can take over, but he thinks that if you show people the benefits of communism, that it can spread. And so this is where communism and democracy become, or communism and free market economics become very competitive. And one of the things that we can become competitive in is the space race. So the Soviets launched Sputnik, which is the first orbiting satellite. The United States quickly tries to replicate that, and we fail miserably. The rocket actually falls over on its side, and it's a big failure for the United States. And that's going to start this idea that there's a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, not just in communism versus democracy, but in the area of intelligence, of aeronautics, of economics. In every area, we are competing. The Soviet Union, at this time period, is going to shoot down a U-2 spy plane. So the United States had proposed that the U.S. and the Soviet Union be allowed to fly over each other's countries to do surveillance, to make sure that there wasn't going to be a nuclear attack. The Soviet Union shot that idea down, and so we developed a U-2 spy plane that flies at really high altitudes where we could carry out surveillance anyways. The Soviet Union knows this is going on. Eventually, we continue to do it. Eisenhower wants to stop. He gets talked into doing one more flight, and that one last flight gets shot down. We try to deny it. Ultimately, we have to admit it. And the big thing is this is going to break down peace talks in the arms race. So we're constantly building more powerful weapons and planes that can carry out attacks while we're trying to talk with the Soviet Union about the need to de-escalate the situation. And we have meetings, and the shooting down of this plane is going to really break down these peace talks, because while we're talking about peace, we're flying over the Soviet Union with planes doing surveillance against them. So that's a little bit of the development. of the fear of communism at home, and then beginning of this buildup of the arms race and the tension that develops between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.